thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Hi, so I'm Catherine Taylor and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. This is a special show today. We're discussing with Jo Facer her brand new book which has come out, which is the ResearchEd Guide to Professional Development, an evidence-informed guide for teachers. Jo has written and commentated extensively on education over the years, and today we're going to discuss her new book and get her reflections on teacher professional development. So I'm just going to bring Jo into the studio. Welcome, Jo. How are you?
Hi, Catherine. It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for asking me.
No, you're very welcome. And I've got to say, I've just been reading the book over the last couple of, I've been dipping in and out to it and reading it over the last few weeks. And I've actually gone back to the beginning and started again because I really enjoyed it. And what I was thinking as I started to read it again to refresh my memory for preparation for today is how you start to talk about how you hope everyone's going to find something that resonates with them. And I absolutely did. So thank you. It's a really engaging body of essays you have there. So thank you for that. I wonder if we could just start by just getting a bit of background about you and sort of your background in education and your journey to get to the position that you are in currently, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so education is so important to me. I honestly feel like it changed my life. I went to a school that wasn't great, and I'm very old, so I won an assisted place, which is something that existed up until like the late 90s, where the government literally paid for me to go to a private school.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so it was completely life-changing, and I went from someone who didn't know anything about anything to suddenly I was in this extraordinary school where teachers they treated me like everyone else. So they had these extraordinarily high expectations for what I could do. They made no excuses. They just kept demanding more of me, and it when I think about my the way I grew up and what I was familiar with, I'd never expected to go to university and have a professional career, and that school enabled me to do those things. And so when it came to thinking about what career to do myself, I thought, I really think every child deserves an education like that opens doors, that makes them think, actually, I could do something different. I could do something more. I could do something that's genuinely exciting. And so I joined the Teach First program because their mission really resonated for me. It made me feel like this is something that I can contribute to, maybe for other children. And I was an English teacher in London. And then from there, I went on, I was a head of English, and I've been a head of year as well. Assistant head and then deputy head, both for curriculum and behaviour. And then I founded a New Start school. I was the founding head there. And after that, I was the head teacher at an all-through very large academy, 3 to 18. And now I run the MPQ faculty at the National Institute of Teaching. So we're sort of an education charity focused on teacher professional development. And my focus is on mainly the leadership programmes here.
Oh, right. Okay. I mean, I'm involved in sort of delivering some of the stuff for MPQs, and I think they're really good courses. Actually, I find them, even as a facilitator and learning mentor, I do find that I'm still learning all the time as well. And I guess that's kind of the point, isn't it? Is that none of us are finished, and we're all continuously dipping into, educational research, which there's so much that just wasn't around. I don't know. I mean, you've obviously been quite, very experienced and have been teaching a fair few years. And I have as well. I've been teaching about 17, 18 years. And there's just stuff that's out there from the world of educational research that wasn't around during my training, certainly. And I just wonder, maybe if I could pick your brain a little bit about that idea there, that, we all should be learning all the time. What draws you to sort of push for professional development? What kind of drives you on that front?
I totally agree. When I look at initial teacher education now, I feel mainly envy that teachers at the start of their career are being exposed to stuff that had such such impact on my practice as a teacher way too late. Like I did the wrong thing in the classroom for like way too many years, and I feel sort of the first book I wrote was kind of filled with a deep shame of that, which was I've been doing it wrong for a long time, but maybe other people can do it right sooner. And I definitely think that professional development is such a strong lever for improving schools for young people. I feel really excited about it and what is possible. Like you say, we can all always improve, and I think that the profession is moving towards this sort of evidence-informed practice where we can be a bit more. We can change what we do as the evidence comes to light. And like I say, I feel deep shame for the way I used to teach, but in 10 years' time, I'll look back and think, oh my goodness, I can't believe I used to do that. And that's a good thing, because we're evolving all the time. We have to evolve. We can't just do the same things we did 5 or 10 years ago, because, not only do we have new evidence, but also I guess the education landscape is always going to be changing. That's the nature of children and the nature of governance. So we have to keep evolving and changing with it. So we have to keep up to date.
No, absolutely. And I wonder if I can ask you, clearly when you've been around in education for a few years, you've sat through various trends and various initiatives that have come down. I don't know about you, but there was a phase I recall where, it wasn't a proper CPD unless we'd all stuck post-it notes or sticky labels on things. Can you maybe describe to me some of your maybe highlights and lowlights of CPD that you've experienced that's really motivated you to try and sort of make it your business to address high quality CPD for teachers?
Definitely. I really, that resonates with me. I think one of the lowest points for me, and anyone delivering safeguarding, it's such a difficult thing to deliver. Yeah. But I remember really vividly someone who was really trying their best to make it an engaging session, and we had to stick labels onto a box. And it was coming from a really good place, but it felt, sticking labels with things like child sexual exploitation on a box felt so inappropriate, and I'm not sure that it had the impact that we were looking to have. I think the other kind of slightly painful thing I've encountered in a number of schools now is that, that 10-minute morning CPD that everyone's 5 minutes late for, and everyone's exhausted, and it's sort of, what can you do in 10 minutes? It's sort of that slightly unaligned scattergun approach. That's something that I remember particularly from my early schools that I worked in. But at the same time, I will say, even in my first school, 15 years ago, I think I had some of the best CPD I've ever had in that school, because basically I had this incredible mentor, Carly, who is now an amazing head teacher, as she should be. And the way she taught me to teach has sort of shown me what it's possible to do. One of the things she did, she actually covered my class so I could go on a subject day. As you do when you're a new teacher, and I'd planned it. And when I came back, it was my most challenging class, and I knew that Carly was amazing and they loved her, so it wasn't challenging for her. But she was like, I've made some changes to your lesson plan. Let me talk you through what I did and why. And it was so clear, where I could see she kind of made her thought process sort of visible to me. So I could see how the things I designed were not going to land. But she hadn't completely changed it. She hadn't said, I'm just going to teach them something different. She'd worked with my ideas and just made them better. And I could then see the next stage. So that, basically any CPD she ever gave me was top quality. And just watching her teach was really great CPD. And I definitely feel now I visit lots of schools in my role at the National Institute of Teaching, and that's for me has been so helpful in seeing what is possible and why. And actually during the pandemic, the other kind of CPD that was excellent was Doug Lemov, who you might expect runs a pretty good CPD session. I was blown away by how he ran remote CPD, because he had a huge room, a huge virtual room. And we all know it's so hard to deliver virtual training and get everyone on board. And he had these little techniques where he made everyone feel really safe and really involved. It's so easy when you're on a screen to think, oh, actually, I'll check my emails. But nobody did, because he both made us feel safe, but also kept us accountable and interested throughout the whole, I think it was an hour and a half session. So when I think about virtual CPD, which again, in my role, I do a lot, I always think back to that Doug Lemov session and what he taught us about what is possible.
Yeah, and I think, I've read some of his work as well, and I do find that there's a lot you can sort of reflect on and get out of it. And one of the things I was thinking of as you were just speaking just there is one of the points, I think it's John Hutchinson in the section of the book in chapter 1, where he says, you can't necessarily measure the quality of a teacher just by observing. But I'm going to sort of maybe cheekily disagree a little bit with that, because I think from what you're saying, there is something intuitive where we can watch people and actually go, right, whatever they're doing, that's good. I want to try and work out what that is. And there's an intuition about it. What do you think about sort of that idea?
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say that about John, because I've known him for a long time. And again, one of the best CPD days I had was I visited his school when he worked at Reach Academy Feltham. And I think that watching him teach, by the way, was like a miracle. He had these Key Stage 2 children just writing essays and being so excited about their learning and so articulate and so impressive that as a secondary teacher, I could not get over what he was doing. But what was helpful was he then, after he taught them, explained to me what he was doing. And this was at a time where I was really trying to understand primary education. It's not my area of specialism. And he was very kind. He took the time to show me around his school, and it was watching the practice, but also having him explain it to me. And I remember at one point, I went into a classroom, and there was quite a big class of primary children learning some maths. And outside the classroom was a very small group of primary children with a big whiteboard, so maybe 3 or 4 of them. And I was like, this is amazing, because all these children seem to be learning, and I'm aware that maths mixed ability is something that as secondary teachers were like, oh, that's scary. How is this happening? And John was then able to explain to me, well, what we've done is we've got really high quality resources in this room. And that's actually the teaching assistant teaching the class. And if you look at this group of 3 or 4 children, that's the teacher with the children who didn't get the concept the first time. And it was, if I had just watched both of those rooms, I would have had no idea of the context. I probably would have I would have assumed that the smaller group was with the teaching assistant, for example. I would have assumed maybe that the teacher had created their resources. So having him talk me through what was happening really helped me to connect the dots there, because just watching a great teacher when you're not yet a great teacher is quite frustrating, because you're like, well, the kids don't do that for me. That's not what it looks like in my room. So how do I bridge that gap?
That's really interesting. And I just want to say, for the record, I actually do think he's right in the sense that too many people do get judged on some quite superficial basis as well. So I do think that there's an awful lot to think about in what we're looking for and what we recognise. But I wonder, actually, on that note, do you have a particular vision of what makes a professional teacher? What kind of qualities, what values? Could you maybe articulate for us what you think teacher professionalism boils down to?
Well, I think, and I always say this whenever I feel a bit removed from schools at the moment, because a lot of my role is working outside of schools. But any day that I spend with teachers, I'm just like, oh, teachers are just the best. Teachers are the best, because every teacher I've met has just really wanted to be great in the classroom for the children. They've just loved kids and loved children learning, and that love comes through in lots of different ways. And teachers have lots of different ways of getting that knowledge across and of behaving in the classroom, which is what I love about teaching. There's not just there are ways sort of and techniques that work better than other techniques, but there's no one way to be a teacher. There's no one teacher personality, let's say. And so I feel like the teachers as professionals is about harnessing that natural love of what they do, that natural love of learning, because teachers, again, love learning more than any other professional I've come across, because I guess it's it's the bread and butter. You spend all day helping other people learn. So what are you interested in doing? Learning. You want to learn. And professional development is just about, we just need to give teachers that opportunity. And what I think we've seen over the years is teachers are delighted to engage with evidence. But when I started teaching, it was kind of, evidence was something that felt very remote, very held by universities, sort of in jargony, difficult to understand language, that was so hard and impenetrable for teachers. And over the years, we've seen so many brilliant education thinkers and writers bring that research into a digestible form. And teachers that I meet are absolutely eating it up. If I've ever read a book and I mention it to a teacher and they haven't read it, I honestly, they will just write it down. And I do the same thing. We're excited to be learning more. So I guess when I think about what does it mean to be a professional, it's giving teachers what they've always wanted and what they need in the most digestible form, so they can have the most impact in the shortest time, because what teachers also don't have is a huge amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess that kind of brings me around to my next question, really, which is sort of why this book and why now? And I guess the reason I'm asking that is because, the elephant in the room is that teachers often don't have the best relationship with their professional development. And, we're thinking about the people who sit at the back and roll their eyes and fold their arms and perhaps are closed to their learning for, I think, a variety of quite valid and complex reasons. But why do you think, the democratization of educational research, which you've described for us there, why do you think your book right now is going to capture and help teachers to get onto that sort of platform of learning in a way that perhaps they don't all do right now?
Well, I've got to say, I've got big sympathy for teachers sitting in whole staff CPD. Like, it is the ultimate mixed ability class. And I always, it sort of blows my mind that we've got seasoned experts sitting next to brand new teachers. We've got maths teachers sitting next to PE teachers. And there's crossover, particularly when you think about routines and behavior management and culture building. But ultimately, you want a French lesson to look really different to a music lesson. They are going to look different. And so it's really hard it is really hard to deliver CPD to a big staff body. And I think the other thing that, those teachers rolling their eyes, a lot of the times that they do that is because they are thinking, or they're saying, I already do that. And some of them do. And it is frustrating when you are experienced and excellent at what you do and you get great results, to have someone say, oh, you might want to make sure you cold call children. And they're like, yeah, literally, did you see every single lesson I taught all day? Like, why am I here? So I totally get that. And the other thing I think is the reason that people can get frustrated with CPD, and that I myself have been frustrated, is because it can't just be teaching techniques. Because if you imagine you're in a school and you sit through a session on questioning, and you come out of that session being able to ask loads of really pertinent, well thought out questions, but you've got a really poor curriculum. So then you get into a lesson and you're like, well, what am I asking them? What am I, if I don't have the nuts and bolts there, or you do practice on managing behavior and creating culture, but ultimately in some schools, your behavior management system is just broken. It's not working. So you're using all these culture building techniques, and the children are being rude to you, and nothing, and you don't have a good system to escalate them through. It is frustrating. So I think that, CPD has to go. Part of what this book is exploring is how we make CPD go sort of hand in hand with those other aspects of making schools great. So, for example, it's pointless to do whole staff CPD but neglect our middle leaders, because if middle leaders are not creating the great curriculum, then any kind of CPD around techniques is not going to land, because that curriculum needs to be in place. For example, SLT need to be driving whole school culture and creating the kind of environment where great teaching can happen, in order for teachers to be able to employ some of the things that they've learned in CPD. And I think I was about to say one of my favourite chapters, but they're all my favourite chapters. It's foolish. But Lizzie Bowling's chapter on whole school CPD, I think, is excellent on this. And she talks about it having kind of a fixed element that is really strategic, but that is also quite flexible. So you've got space to respond to emerging needs, and you've got space to make it a bit more tailored. And why this book? Because I think CPD is the thing that will transform pupil outcomes and experiences, that is also effectively free, because we are almost every school. I've never experienced a school that doesn't set aside time for it, or hasn't got a member of staff responsible for it. So these people exist. It's not like we need an extra £100,000 this year to do it. We have it. We have it right now, and it could massively leverage teachers and classrooms to be even better at what they do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by, full disclosure, I've just been doing my Ed D on the subject of teacher learning and all the rest of it. So I do find it a really fascinating area. And I wonder, I mean, I've got a belief that a little bit of structure can really go a long way. And going back to John Hutchinson's chapter again, where he said, part of the issue, as you've alluded to, is the diverse audience, and there will be some people, obviously we've had the practical side of it and the fact that they've got their existing practice and their knowledge and so forth. But there's also kind of a philosophical element to this, which is about sort of teacher autonomy, teacher agency. And, he points out that some people will think, this evidence and this structure is really empowering to me. And others will be sitting there thinking that, it's a neoliberal kind of ideological, enforced negative experience for them. And I wonder, where do you sit on that line of the structure being an enabling rather than a constraining part of CPD?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really complex question, isn't it? And I think ultimately, my own personal preferences will play into how I feel about this. I think that structures, for me, structure liberates and also provides a minimum bar. And so I do think that I do think teacher autonomy is extremely important at a certain point, in that so for example, when I was a brand new teacher, like I said, I did teach first. We had 6 weeks of training, which is not enough. I was told, I was given all the autonomy I could have ever wanted. I could teach any book I wanted, and the first thing I did was I went into the English cupboard, and what I could teach was the only book that we had a full class set of, and nobody had taught it before, and everyone had snagged their books early, so I had to go and make a scheme of work about this book that I didn't really know very well, and that's too much autonomy. I was not ready for that, whereas had I had 10 years of experience, I might have thought, this is brilliant, because I've always wanted to teach purple hibiscus. This is a perfect opportunity for me to bring my own excitement and joy of this book to these children. I do get that, and there's always sort of payoffs, aren't there? Because a colleague of mine joined our school, and she planned the first few lessons for her class, and she turned up, and they said, we did 12th night last year. And not having that set curriculum was really just meant that she had a lot of very urgent work to do, and a very frustrating lesson with that year 8 class. So I personally sit on the side of structure, but I can also sympathise with teachers who do want more autonomy. And there are schools that offer that. There are schools that offer huge amounts of autonomy and they make it work. And I, as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about systems and structures, and working in some of the more challenging contexts, I'm sort of like, that's not something I think a lot about, because I think in the schools that I've worked in, that I still work in, that's not a priority. The priority is, let's get these children the best possible curriculum and the best teaching experience we can as fast as possible, because time is of the essence. These children don't have years to waste while I become a decent teacher and I work my way through understanding how to plan a lesson. They don't have time. Their time is now. Their exams are now. So yeah, but that's my personal view.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you, and I do. I definitely am sit on the side of the structure is liberating, and I think that there's the kind of the toolkit analogy, isn't there? You can learn a lot of techniques and then choose when you deploy them and so forth, but you can't just go in there and wing it as if you're Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society or something like that. We just that's what we.
Williams, he's the best. And you know what? And when I started teaching, do we all dream of being him? Don't we? And that it's hard to disconnect from that, because we all want to have that impact on children. And there's no child who says, Miss Facer, she just took us step by step through the exam paper and made sure we could. No one remembers that. But it's that kind of that ego thing, isn't it? Where you're like, you want to be the beloved teacher and inspire this generation of children, and lots of teachers do that within structures, which is great. But what's probably
it's about sort of the coverage, isn't it? The reliability and the maximum amount of engagement that you can do for the maximum amount of children at the maximum amount of the time. And there are some things that just do that better than other things, aren't there?
Yeah.
Just staying on the subject of structure, then you're obviously heavily involved with the government regulatory qualifications and the ECF and things like that. How important do you think those qualifications and those frameworks are to teach a CPD? And do you think more could be done to engage more teachers for a longer period of time in that kind of approach?
And this is something that I've learned a lot about as I've gone on in my career, and because I think I was so lucky in my early career to work in schools, some of the best schools in the country by performance measures, by Ofsted measures, and those schools develop teachers exceptionally well without government frameworks, right? But the more I've kind of gone on in my career, the more I've seen the reality is that there are a lot of schools where they just didn't have that infrastructure and that support. And so there are teachers across the country who were not benefiting from the kind of sort of bespoke in-house CPD that I managed to benefit from through sheer luck and through working in mainly London schools, which tended to be filled with lots of people who were sort of finger on the pulse and really exciting and dynamic and doing new things. And I do think that I guess similarly for the children, having those structures in place does give us a minimum bar. Having the early career framework does mean that every early career teacher has that baseline of understanding and that the opportunity to access stuff that every teacher should have, and it allows us to say we've done that. And I will say I don't know a huge amount about the ECF, to be fair. I spend almost all my time thinking about MPQs, and which I think are really important, because again, in every school I've worked in, we have had limited time, and normally the focus for a lot of the year is getting every teacher to a minimum bar, and you worry much less about your best teachers. So you think Miss so-and-so in that classroom is doing a brilliant job with 9F, like leave her alone, she can just enjoy that, where she's sitting there being like, but I'd love to be a head of department, but I don't know what to do, maybe I'm not ready. And it's great to be able as a school to outsource that and say, do you know what, you want to learn some leadership stuff. We don't necessarily have capacity to teach you how to be a leader and to get our 12 ECTs to be good enough in the classroom that we want to put every child in front of them. So I do think it's very helpful to have qualifications that are robust, so people can get that additional development that they probably won't get in school. Although I will say I've also, in my role, have come into contact with some really impressive academy trusts that are starting to do that, that are starting to develop leaders and to have those kind of leadership pipelines. So it certainly is absolutely happening. It's just about opening up that opportunity for every colleague, including people who are not in a big multi-academy trust, who are in a standalone primary school in the middle of the countryside, and saying, actually, your tiny little primary school does not have the capacity to also develop you in this. So, here is an opportunity to get you to develop in this way.
And they're recognisable, aren't they? And they're transferable, and people are able to sort of see them. So I think they're really powerful things. I'm always a slight odd angle with these things, if you'll pardon the expression, because I mark for them and I facilitate for them. I've never actually done one, but probably I should at some point once I finish my doctorate. But I do find them, as I said earlier, really good CPD personally, even from the end of them that I'm operating. So I think they're really good. And I just want to just name check again your book and just say we're talking today about the ResearchEd Guide to Professional Development, an evidence-informed guide for teachers, which is published by John Catt. And I think, it's been such a rich experience reading it. It's got some really brilliant chapters in there from some really, really interesting perspectives. And I just want to bring the conversation round, having talked about with such passion about teacher learning. Let's get real for a minute and talk about logistics, which in my view is one of the places where all of this good work and these good ideas can come unstuck, because if you're looking at a school and they can't get everyone together, or they can't have the department meeting, or you've got people who are part-time who can't be in at the same time, or one of my personal troubles that I have to deal with is people who are in more than one department and have to split their time between meetings, and so you never quite get everyone together at the same time. What do you advise, or what would you say to teachers or school leaders or even governors who are saying they just can't find the time and resource investment to make changes to accommodate some of these suggestions that are being made?
Yeah, first I hear that. We don't have time as teachers to use the bathroom in school. So we don't have enough resource to fix the leaking roof. There are so many competing demands on teacher time, and just increasingly less resource and just more being put onto teachers and leaders. So that is absolutely a huge concern. And I also think that, I understand that we're already, we're at the end of October, we're in half term. Changing priorities, even at this point in a school year, it might not be the right course. People don't normally come back in November and welcome we're actually going to do CPD in a totally different way now. People might not love that, and actually the tiny tweaks might be more sustainable, keeping people on side and kind of making sure workload and confusion don't increase. I guess the flip side of that is that, if we develop teachers, children get a better deal. No school I've encountered has zero CPD time. We have a responsibility to make the absolute most of that time. And I do think some of the things in this book are it's an approach. It's an approach that you could adopt. So you can absolutely change the structure of your CPD session. You can keep the topics the same. You can keep the timings the same, but you might change the structure to make sure that teachers get as much as possible out of it. You might introduce a deliberate practice element. You might introduce, instead of doing lots and lots of whole staff CPD, you might use the same kind of time, but put it in smaller groups, make it more bespoke, and use that time and resource in the best possible way we can. And one of the chapters in the book is written by Jenny Thompson, who's an executive at Dixon's Academy Trust.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
They are absolutely famous for thinking about things differently. And although she doesn't write as much about it as I wish she would, you can read a lot about it online. The Dixon's model is fascinating because they decided that teacher coaching was a priority and that we never have enough time to do it. And so what they did was they just flexed their model, and they this was the case when I visited a few years ago. I believe it's still the case. My apologies if they've evolved and changed that. But they used to start every day with group coaching. So teachers working on their teaching in small groups, while senior leaders would take an entire year group of children through either a revision session, or they would do some quizzing, or they would do an assembly. So they would do those big set pieces because they had such a strong school culture. They could hold lots and lots of children with very few members of staff, and then free that time up for teachers to coach each other. Now, and I'm definitely not saying, so pick that model up and do it in your school. What I'm saying, like, this is a problem, but it's a problem that lots of schools and trusts are finding very innovative ways to tackle. And I do think, much as I feel discomfort with saying Twitter, given the kind of political, I need I say no more. But you can find some extremely inspiring examples through Twitter of schools doing innovative, exciting things, which gives me huge hope that although time is not on our side, resource is not on our side, schools are doing these things and they are innovating. And there's a school out there that is not on Twitter that nobody's heard of that is doing the most exciting thing of all. And so please come forward and tell us what you're doing now.
No, I'm absolutely behind what you're saying. I mean, I constantly want to think, I don't know, I don't want to get too philosophical, but I'm always reminded of John Stuart Mill, who sort of says, I think it's on Liberty, who basically says, everything might be fine, but we have a responsibility to essentially challenge it, unpick it, take it apart, see what's under the hood. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and then put it back together. And it could be that we end up with exactly the same as what we started with, but at least we know that it's good because we checked. It's when you don't check and you just keep going because it's what we've already done before that I think, that's not really enough. And I'd really like to see, more innovation and people taking a radical look at things, even if we put it back together and it turns out that we were doing it as effectively as we could, which I've got my doubts about. But it's I think it's so important to be ready to try something like that and actually test it and see if it works in a particular context. So I really appreciated that that perspective from that Academy Trust that you mentioned. I wonder if we can move on a little bit because, sometimes, and I've had this from working on some of the specialist MPQs, I get to see a lot of people who are aspiring middle leaders and they're coming along because they want to get into middle leadership, and maybe they're had quite experienced, maybe they are, ECT 3, as it were. You get a big range. And one of the things they say is, look, this is all very well and good, but I know if I go back in and I knock on the deputy head for curriculum's door tomorrow and I say this, that, and the other, they're just going to, say, well, I'm sorry, we haven't got the capacity, or there's other priorities, or whatever. And I know that they removed the project that you would do in school from the old MPQ ML, and I see good reasons, because we can't have lots of people doing disparate projects all over the place. It's just not manageable. But what would you say to a teacher who's really keen and they've read the book and they're really inspired and they want to take it back into school, how might they, for want of a better phrase, manage up?
It's such a good question, and such a frustrating position to be in, for aspiring leaders. I think why do senior leaders say no to people like that? It's because they are probably very overstretched, and they can't conceive of a strategic thing changing, because that requires a lot of thought, and they probably did a lot of thinking before term started. Now they're drowning in the detail, and so I guess what I'd say to people like that is, what you want to present is, I am taking work off you. I am going to make your life easier by doing blah, and saying, look, what's a thing that you're struggling to do, or struggling to think about? Let me help. Let me help. Let me help. And there are very few. If you're keen and capable, that I would hope that most senior leaders will say, yes, please, I'd like that help. Now, say they don't, because that is conceivably what they'll do. And you want to kind of employ these practices yourself. There is absolutely nothing stopping you as an individual developing yourself and others. Like you in your school, so we know that in-school variation is greater than between-school variation. So even if you're sitting in one of the lowest performing schools in the country, someone in your school, maybe it's you, but there will be brilliant teachers in your school. Go and see them. Go and see them and say, talk to me about what you did. Why did you do it? And if you are that person, be that model. Go to the ECTs and say, do you want to come into my classroom? Do you want to watch what I'm doing? I'm trying this new thing. I'd love your feedback. I'd love you to talk, and just like getting that culture where you just informally invite people in and go and watch your heroes and ask them why they did what they did. Talk to people in the staff room. Do you want to start a teacher education group? Should we trial a few of these approaches together? Should we do some practice together? And then when you've done that, you can go to the leadership team and say, look, I've got 8 people. We are giving up our Wednesday lunchtime to do practice. Look at the impact it's having in our classrooms and how excited we are. Could we roll this out? And I would say that, when I was a middle leader, some of the most effective CPD I rolled out started as voluntary, because I didn't have the traction or the relationships to say, we're all going to do this. I just said, I really want to do this thing. Who wants to trial it with me? And then when it worked, they became the people who went out and said, oh, we're all going to do this thing because it's actually had this impact on my teaching. And in some ways, isn't that like the best thing to do? Because if it didn't have an impact, no one will talk about it and we wouldn't waste anyone else's time. And if it did have an impact, then we could say, oh, we know this has been a good investment of time. Let's roll it out to other people.
That's really brilliant. And I'm I suppose not guilty, it's not the right word, but I'm the person who has gone off and actually done an EdD to try and understand the situation that I'm in a little bit more clearly. And I think I would definitely say that when I started it, I was quite frustrated for some of the reasons that we've talked about. But I definitely do feel, even though it's been a hard road to do the research that I've done, I do feel so much more enriched by it. And so I guess the message that I'm agreeing with you here is that if it really, working harder and giving up some time and investing in something to try out and see if it works can actually make you feel better, even though you're putting more in. And I think that comes back to your earlier point about how, as teachers, we do love to learn, don't we? And we do find it very satisfying. So yes, I think it's a really good thing to actually be a bit proactive and try things out. But let's to play devil's advocate again, going on to the next thought, which is that, we are we have this squeezed middle. I mean, I tend to think we've got a stereotype of teachers who are late career, who might be a bit disenfranchised and all the rest of it. My view and my research, I think most of the people who feel like that probably are already going and have gone or retired. There's very few sort of 35-yearers carrying on at this point in time. But what we do have is people in their 30s, maybe, got young families, older parents, maybe their own health issues, maybe they've got a TLR. And we do have a cohort of teachers who are seeking flexibility. And it could be because, people talk about millennials. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but there's definitely people who want a flexible job rather than an overwhelming lifestyle that affects everybody. And I guess head teachers and leaders are looking to balance the pulls out of the classroom and create those flexible scenarios and working patterns. But that does, as I alluded to earlier, put pressure on CPD, because then, you can't get everyone in the room at the same time and so forth. And I wonder what your views on that tension are.
I think that the move to flexible working in education is something that when I first heard of that, I thought this is I remember the first time I worked with a deputy head who worked 2.5 days a week. And I thought, and I was so biased. I said, that is a nonsense. What on earth is she going to do on 2.5 days a week? And then I met her and was like, oh, I see. She, does triple what anyone else does on half the time. And she was one of the most effective leaders I've ever worked with. And her name was Jess. And she totally changed my mind on flexible working. And then when I became a head teacher, I inherited a staff where they'd really nurtured talent, and they had been very generous in granting flexible working. And going into that scenario as a head teacher, even knowing what I knew, I thought, oh, this is going to be so challenging to manage. And I will say that every colleague I have worked with who has been granted flexible working different hours and different days, has been so effective at their job. And I almost wonder if they are more effective because other aspects of their life were taken care of, so therefore were less stressful for them, and they had a bit more space and time to think about something totally different, which meant that we have this sort of perception of, if you miss the staff meeting, you're not going to know anything. But I worked with one of my vice principals in my last school was 2 days a week, and she missed every whole staff meeting, but she always knew everything that was happening in the school on 2 days a week, because she was absolutely brilliant and had the time and the space to dedicate to her family, which was her priority at that time, which was absolutely right for her. So I will just say, before I say anything, is that I don't think we should be afraid of flexible working. I think I definitely was afraid of it. I was extremely surprised by how positive all of my experiences with it, with people leading flexibly, have been. And in terms of, we can't get everyone in one place at the same time, I think probably more bespoke CPD is probably a good thing. So, we probably want to have less of everyone being in the hall at the same time anyway. And you know what? Everyone in the hall, that can be recorded and watched later. Or listen to as a podcast later. And actually, the more we can do, observations, coaching, small groups, department time, where we apply those kind of principles and concepts in small groups, which can be flexible, because you can probably say, even if your department is, a few people are 3 days a week, for example, you identify a day when everyone is in. We're all here Tuesday period 3, so let's do that. And making it kind of flexing it in that way, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you, and I think there's so many options out there these days. I don't know, off the top of my head, but in terms of the power of timetabling options, it doesn't have to be as onerous a task as people might imagine. I don't know if that's your experience.
Yeah, so I've never written a timetable, but my understanding is that there's some absolutely magical things that software can do at the moment. And again, I think, Dixons are doing some really innovative stuff around flexible working. There's a lot of in the schools I've worked at, I've seen some really brilliant approaches to flexible working, and I would encourage all school leaders to just look to those colleagues and find out what great practice is out there, because I think it's important for us as a profession to keep growing and to keep understanding how we can flex our approaches to retain really excellent people. And there's a season for all things, isn't there? You like you say, you'll have people who have caring responsibilities, or they have chronic illness, or they have things that will affect them for a short period of time, for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. But a career is, I don't know, 50 years, 55 years now. What is it? We've got to make sure we've got to see it as a long-term investment in that individual, even if it isn't the absolute perfect thing for the school, and it is always a balance, isn't it? Because I would rather my year 9 class had one teacher and not two, but also I would rather they had two teachers they knew well, who knew them well, than one brand new teacher who didn't know them or the school, who I had to teach how to teach. What's the better experience for the children in that scenario? So you're always trying to, any school leader running a school is always trying to balance so many things, and you're never going to run the perfect school, I'm afraid, because schools are created by human beings and none of us are perfect. So, but we can keep trying.
No, that's really cool. Thank you. Really, really interesting. And just going back to the idea, we talked a little bit earlier about structure and the way that real life is and the way that we would like it to be, and the tension between those. I just wanted to ask you, because quite a lot of the chapters do actually provide some protocols or some scripted discussion starters or flowcharts or things like that, which would guide leaders or teachers through implementation of either the content of the CPD or the structure of the department meeting or the sort of wider sort of development of leaders. I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on the utility of structures and scaffolds for the learning that adults experience that are included in the book.
Yeah, and again, like my personal bias is that structure liberates. I think that there's always the possibility of a lethal mutation. When, anytime if I try and replicate what you are doing in your school and I just think I'm doing it, I'm probably not doing it. Whereas if you gave me a structure and said, well, first I do this, then this, then this, I'm much more likely to be able to replicate something I've seen that I think is good. You can always flex that model. I think, the best teachers I see will take a lesson plan and they will make it their own. And it's the same with a script. It's the same with a flowchart. If you're great at what you do, you will use that as the sort of the jumping off point, and you'll make it something even better. And if you're not skilled, you're at least going to meet a minimum bar. And so often when I visit great schools and I see great teaching happen, I just like, well, how did you do that? Like, what did you do to make it happen? And actually you sort of want someone to say, well, first we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, because otherwise you're just sitting there watching this like model of excellence, but you're no closer to being able to make anything like that happen yourself.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I've been to several events where I've been to see various people talk about these kinds of things and deliberate practice and rehearsing things, and how teachers can find it a bit uncomfortable if they're not used to it, but actually really find it very beneficial and lean into it after they've kind of broken down the barrier of the rehearsal stage or whatever it might be. So I think it's really interesting. And I think you do get a lot. It's not quite muscle memory. I don't think that's quite what I mean, but it's like there are things that become mental models that become unconscious. Once you start to do them, you don't have to think about them. And certainly this is something I've noticed in my practice. There are things that I now do that I used to make an effort to remember to do that now I just do. And, I think it's really important to take the time to build those sort of routines in, because that puts it, if we think about cognitive load or whatever, it puts it into the unconscious bit where it just happens, rather than the bit that is taking up your time. That means you can't remember to check the timings of your lesson or remember, the part of the routine or something like that. So I do think it's really important to kind of embed it. But before we move on, I just want to remind listeners that we're talking today to Jo Facer about the ResearchEd Guide to Professional Development, which is an evidence-informed guide for teachers and published by John Catt. And we're having a really, really interesting discussion. And thank you, Jo. It's been so interesting to hear your perspective and experience on some of these things. And I just want to ask, because I've picked out a couple of the chapters that I personally really enjoyed. I've already mentioned John Hutchinson a couple of times, but I also really enjoyed the Madeline Fresco Brown on inset, because as much as we'd say we didn't want to have people necessarily all in the hall together, it does need to happen. And I thought her chapter was really, really interesting. And I just wonder if you could just sort of say something about how you might advise leaders who need to implement something in their setting, as opposed to sort of trust-wide. How do you kind of give them the flexibility to organise context-specific needs, particularly if something's happened and they need to change things around quickly, as opposed to a school where things are a lot more comfortable?
Yeah, and I've got to say, I love Madeline's chapter as well. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I think, maybe I'm wrong and I haven't read enough, but I can't remember reading anyone say, here's how you should run an inset session. And every teacher has them, and they're some of the worst CPD you've ever had, so I really urge school leaders to read Maddie's chapter. And she's got a brilliant way of very clearly sort of advising us what works really well, and a lot of it is the same as delivering great CPD, but like you say, a lot of it is different. It's different delivering health and safety to a whole staff. So she's got some really, really awesome suggestions there, so definitely check her chapter out. Different schools have different needs. I think that this sort of goes down to the kind of traditional leadership, which is, I think, in a school that needs a quick change, I would normally find it more beneficial to be quite directive. And actually, you know what? I think that schools requiring big change are a gift, because normally in those schools, people want change.
Yes.
And I've worked with and in schools where people say, we'll try anything. We'll try anything. And oh my goodness, thank you. That's so wonderful. And people in schools that are like that, who stay because they are dedicated to the school and the community and the children, some of the best people in education staying in some of the worst schools for the right reasons. And if they get great leadership come in and just say, look, we're just going to try this. Normally, that's really, really the most effective way. And the challenge with that is, you need to be so clear about what needs to happen and why. You need to communicate that with real clarity, and then relentlessly follow up. And with big changes, probably, depending on the scale and size of the change in school, it's sort of make the change, shrink the change, make it as small as possible.
Yes.
Because what you can't do is say, we're changing the entire behaviour policy and the shape of the school day and the curriculum and the lesson planning and our approach to SEND. Enjoy, everyone. That's a little bit much. But yeah, and I actually, for me personally, I have found it more challenging going into schools that are already very good, because it's really, really hard to get people to buy into that kind of slow change and incremental improvement. Because there's always a sense with schools of like, we always want to get there. Once we get there, once we're great, then it will be less work. And so when you go to a school where they get great results and you say, oh, it could be even better, people say, no, thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't want even more work, because normally in those schools, people have worked so hard to get to that place. They're just exhausted. And so that's sort of, I think, a tougher challenge. And when I've worked in schools like that, I think the first thing to do is to celebrate where you are, celebrate the work that people have done, and respect it and talk about it way more than you think you need to, because people have worked for years and years and years on that stuff. And it's not good enough to say, oh, opening line of an inset, you did a really good job, now let's move on. You got to keep coming back to it and keep celebrating by name the things that people have done, and then clarify why we can get even better. And that's all about staff engagement. That's all about getting, ideally in a school like that, you want other people to be leading that change and other people to be saying what they need and why and coming up with those ideas, because they're not in a great school. People don't tend to want to be imposed on and told what to do. They've normally got to that really great position and they want a bit more autonomy as a sort of a reward for that, and they probably deserve it. And I think this is kind of where we get this sort of what I sort of cheekily call benign brainwashing, which is, just trying to get people to believe that we can all do better even than we have done. And the other thing with schools like that is like even the worst schools have got great practice, but the best schools are going to have so much great practice. So when you're trying to think about lifting the minimum bar, you're sharing that great practice from within, and that bar can be so high in schools like that. And so you're working on getting every single member of staff to that, the very sort of the highest point that they can get to. So I think very different approaches. And I bet there's like 5 or 6 other approaches that don't fall into either of those big camps that I've described. And there are very skilled leaders out there who are laughing at what I've said. So apologies, but that's my basic understanding.
No, that's really brilliant. Thank you. And, I think it's a really exciting time to be a teacher. And I really, as you probably can tell by the fact that I'm doing this and talking to you about it and you're talking to me about it, I do think the democratization of CPD and, really unpacking some of these things and making them explicit, I think is a really positive thing for CPD at the moment. And I just wonder, there's a couple more things I wanted to talk about. One of them is because I really enjoyed the Isaac Moore and the John Gilbert chapters as well. And the first one, Isaac Moore one, is all about developing leaders, and the second one, John Gilbert, is all about the trust perspective. And the reason I like those is, we've alluded to this a little bit, but it's that kind of talent management and bringing people through not only in their pedagogy and their subject knowledge and so forth, but actually in their skills as leaders of people and their people management competencies. And I just wonder if you wanted to comment on the importance of growing talent within a school and the role that larger organisations like multi-academy trusts might play in that sort of area.
Definitely. And I love Isaac's chapter because one of the things I love about this is it's not just about the kind of the theory of professional development. It's also the theory of leadership and developing leaders. And he's really drawn on like a lot of his own experiences, but also his wider reading to just share how we develop leaders and what we should be doing. And it's really worth a read if you're interested in thinking about what it means to lead others. It's a chapter that's a lot about kind of the interpersonal relationships that leaders form, which is sort of the stuff of leadership is people, and he writes so beautiful about it. So yeah, really big recommend for that. And like you say, we increasingly have this position as a central trust level as we have more and more multi-academy trusts in this country, and that's why I asked John to write that chapter about MATs and the role that they play, and he did a really great job, because when I said to John that you need to look at the research, and he was like there's literally none. There's no research on how you run this at MAT level. And I was like, that is fair enough. It's a very new thing. So he did a really great job in he essentially talked to his very wide network of other people doing this job and tried to work out what's sort of common. So he had a very challenging job there. And I do think that role of the like MAT level professional development person is something that people can look on. People in schools day to day I would say is the hardest job. The people in school and every job I've had in education has been easier than teaching 6 periods a day. There's literally no job. Even running a school is not as hard, I think, as teaching a full timetable, physically, emotionally, mentally draining. And so it can, people can look with scorn at these, people who work in the central team and they just pop into my school and tell me stuff. And people get a bit cross about that. But I do think it's actually quite helpful to have an external pair of eyes.
Mm.
And I remember really vividly walking around a school as a new leader, and I was went into this classroom of a science teacher, and the deputy head said to me, "She's our best teacher. She's brilliant." And we watched the lesson and we walked out, and I said, "So what would you tell her she could improve?" And he was like, "Oh, nothing, Joan. That was amazing." And I was like, okay, well, okay, she was great, brilliant. But here's a couple of things I saw. And you know what was fascinating was 6 months later, I walked into that same teacher's class and I left, and I couldn't think of a single thing she could improve. And it's not because she had magically become the perfect teacher. It was the frog in water. I couldn't see it anymore. I respected her as a professional so much. I was in awe of what the more I got to know her, the more I realized she was so spectacular in the classroom. I suddenly couldn't see any areas for improvement anymore. And that's when someone who isn't in your school every single day can be the right person, can be so helpful to help you see, particularly your brighter spots. How do you make them even brighter? Because it's relatively straightforward to go into a classroom of an inexperienced teacher and say, "Oh, just use the behavior policy and do it in this way." But it's much harder to go into an experienced, excellent teacher's classroom and give them anything that's of any use to them to improve.
No, that's really interesting. And I guess, it's not something I'd thought of until just this moment, actually. But when we think about the role of the inspectorate and things like that, and, are they there to quality assure, or are they there to help people? Is it developmental, or is it, and I don't necessarily want to get into that discussion right now, but I think what you're saying is really interesting, which is that you've got to have that pair of fresh eyes, haven't you, to bring to your attention things that have become quite mundane and ordinary in your context. So I think that's a really good point. So thank you for that. Staying on the subject of CPD, as we've been discussing this afternoon, one can't help but read this book and actually realise that there's an awful lot to be optimistic about. Why do you personally feel we should be optimistic about the future of CPD and teacher development?
I think we're coming to such an exciting moment in teacher development where, so the great practice in delivering professional development that actually has impact on children in classrooms is a reality for so many colleagues in the country right now, and could be even better. We have these evidence-informed frameworks that have been formed by some extraordinary thinkers in education and have been refined and are being worked on and refined even now. The research movement has gathered so much momentum in the last 10, 15 years, bringing research into the hands of teachers in a way that we can use it in the classroom. And we are increasingly a research-driven profession. I do feel extremely optimistic, and the new government does say it's a priority. So that's exciting as well.
No, it's very easy to say, what's the most radical thing that could be done for education, and just have the answer of, well, could you fund it, please? But no, I agree. We've got many good reasons to be optimistic about the way the wind seems to be blowing, and I agree with you on that. But let's just suppose, and we're sort of coming to the end of our chat now. If you could rub a magic lamp and get your 3 CPD wishes, what would you wish for and why?
What an amazing question. I love magic lamp. Okay. Again, I'm going to bring my own biases and my own experiences to bear in how I answer this question. So I bet I'm going to say something and so many listeners are going to think, oh, that would be awful, because their experience will be different to mine. My first wish would be that every teacher had an observation with feedback every week, every day, that genuinely made them better in the next lesson. So like that incremental improvement that is totally tailored to your practice. That's my first wish. And if you've ever experienced coaching and hated it, you hate what I've said. But for me, that made me a better teacher, and I wish everyone could have that. My second wish would be that leaders had the same feedback on the core aspects of leadership. So like how they run a meeting, how they run line management, how they run HR, how they run finance. And they're given that incremental feedback, but on the things that they are doing, the leadership activities that they are doing, because so many meetings that people sit in are wasting their time. And I don't want anyone's time to ever be wasted. And actually that links to my third wish, which is that no teacher will ever sit in the gym thinking, this is a waste of my time.
No, and I think, you know, teachers up and down the land will be raising a glass to that, because, you know, when you're time poor, I think it's very easy to start to resent your time being misused. And I think we absolutely need to be respectful of teachers' time and find ways that they can enjoy their learning. I think, you know, what we think so much about how children learn, and I think it's so important that we also consider really carefully how adults learn, and I think this movement in sort of research informed education, as long as we continue to apply those things to the way we deliver that to our professional adults as well, I think that's going to be where the magic happens. Brilliant. Okay, well, we've been talking, I've been talking to Jo Facer this afternoon all about her new book, which is out. It's published by John Catt Education, and it's the ResearchEd Guide to Professional Development, an evidence-informed guide for teachers. I honestly can't recommend it highly enough. I've really, really enjoyed it, and I can see that I definitely will dip in and out of it as time goes on. I've already recommended it to some colleagues as well, so do check it out. It brings us to the end of our chat today. There are many, many more Teachers Talk Radio broadcasts all week and on our website as well. So please do check them out. And I just want to extend my great thanks to Jo Facer, who has spent time with me this afternoon having this conversation. It's been so interesting, and your enthusiasm and knowledge is just so clear and inspirational. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I've loved it.
Thank you very much, Jo.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.